Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, getting you up to speed with the stories powering the global sports industry. I'm Catherine Davies, your podcast host, and this week Faaez Samadi and Jonathan Rest have joined me to talk about cricket, and specifically about Cricket Down Under and Cricket Australia's brand new principal sponsor, Westpac. We'll also discuss the continued rumblings of massive changes potentially in store for Australian limited over cricket in the shape of private investment. Maria Kholodova will then join in to give us her insights and analysis on the Women's Tennis Association and its transition from WTA Media to WTA Ventures, as well as her views on the proposed merger with the ATP Men's Tour. Finally, Jonathan Rest and Martin Ross will bring us up to speed on the betting rights landscape, which is rapidly consolidating and appears to now be a two-horse race with Genius Sports and Sportradar leading the pack. To our listeners, don't forget to leave us your feedback in a review on the Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms, and let us know if you like what you're hearing and what you'd like to know more about. And now, moving straight into our first topic for the day, I've got Faaez Samadi, our Deputy Editor of Sponsorship, and Jonathan Rest, our Global Sports Reporter, here with me now for an in-depth discussion into Cricket Australia's latest initiatives. Good day, gentlemen.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Now, Faaez, yesterday you wrote a piece unveiling the details around Cricket Australia's announcement that it had finally secured a new principal sponsor in the shape of Westpac, the Australian bank, which becomes the front of shirt sponsor for both the men's and women's national teams across all formats. That in itself is a new development, and it's a very big deal for Cricket Australia, which has had a tough time selling the men's front of shirts rights for a couple of years. It was good to get this monkey off their back, you told me. What more can you tell me about this deal?
Yeah, Catherine, very much so. This is a really big deal for Cricket Australia. They've secured Westpac as their new official banking partner and front of shirt partner to both the men's and women's teams in Australia. So Australia split their front of shirt rights, and Qantas, the Australian national carrier, is the overseas shirt partner for when the teams are on tour. But at home, it will now be Westpac. And it's been a significant thing for Cricket Australia for quite a while. I mean, the women's team used to have Commonwealth Bank of Australia as their front of shirt sponsor, and we can get into that in a little bit. But the men's team, this is a really big deal because they've been searching for a permanent front of shirt home sponsor for a couple of years now, and I know that it's been a real sort of priority for the Cricket Australia commercial team. They had some pretty good deals in place. They had a bit of trouble like everybody around COVID, and then they had a permanent front of shirt sponsor in Alinta Energy. That deal ended, and they've had a couple of years trying to fill that gap, and now they've got a 4-year deal with Westpac, who are, by most reckoning, I think the second largest bank in Australia, behind Commonwealth Bank. And it's a particular coup for Westpac because they've broken up Commonwealth Bank's relationship with Cricket Australia, which has actually been 37 years. So they've more latterly shifted their focus to the women's team, but they've actually sponsored Cricket Australia since 1987. So it's a huge deal for Westpac. And as I say, for Cricket Australia, they've had a torrid time with the men's front of shirt. So they'll be really pleased with this.
Now, you mentioned Commonwealth Bank, CommBank, and how they've had that long relationship. And so how did the end of that relationship come about? Did Commonwealth Bank leave, or were they pushed? What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's interesting. There's quite a few sort of details in the background here. So it was towards the end of last year that Cricket Australia and CommBank put out a joint statement explaining that CommBank, after 37 years, were not going to renew their relationship, which actually ended at the end of June this year. And that was quite a big signal to the market because, obviously, as I say, it's been 37 years and CommBank have been fairly synonymous with cricket in Australia in that time. But our understanding is that CommBank were really quite keen to continue the relationship, but Cricket Australia had spent quite a lot of time in the background talking to Westpac and sounding them out about taking on both the men's front of shirt and the women's front of shirt rights. This was a really big deal for Cricket Australia in terms of getting a new sponsor. I think because of the experience they'd had trying to sell them separately, particularly the men's one, they really wanted the stability of somebody who came in and took the men's and women's. And just to go back a little bit in time, you know, CommBank was a major sponsor of both the men's and the women's team for many years, and then sort of chose to focus almost exclusively on the women's team being front of shirt and putting most of their spend there around about the time of what was known as the sandpaper sort of cheating scandal in the Australian men's game. It's too long to get into, but they were basically caught with using sandpaper to sort of deface the ball on a pitch. It was a huge deal in Australia. The headlines were full of it. There was an inquiry. Players were sacked, all sorts of things. Anyway, so that happens. That sort of times around the same time that CommBank move across. And then they've been exclusively focused, almost exclusively focused on women's game. And so it's not such a big deal for CA. They get in Alinta Energy as their new front of shirt partner for the men's team in Australia. Big energy firm paying sort of a decent fee. But then SportBusiness exclusively revealed in October 2022 that Alinta Energy were not going to renew again when their deal ended up the following June, in June 2023. Quite a big blow, I think, and quite unexpected. But then, since then, it's been a real struggle for Cricket Australia to find a permanent sponsor for that men's home deal. So much so that you hear about it. October 2022 is when we made public that Alinta Energy were going to pull out. They announced in December 2023 that Toyota were coming in to take on the men's home front of shirt asset sort of on a temporary basis to cover the World Cup that was coming up later that year. And to think that they've known for sort of the best part of 2 years and weren't able to find a permanent buyer for that home asset just sort of shows the difficulty they were having with it. So with that delay in finding a permanent home sponsor, it actually lined up quite nicely with the end of CommBank's agreement for the women's front of shirt. So that's where I think the strategy came into place and crystallised around finding a single sponsor for both. And they've managed to do that in Westpac. And my understanding again is that, CommBank, I think, were caught a little bit cold by the Westpac approach, and then actually to have publicly stated since that they were keen to continue the conversation and continue the relationship with CA, but by then I think it was sort of too late. So that's why I described it as something of a real coup for Westpac, because the Australian sports market is incredibly competitive in terms of sponsorship. They're a huge sports market, lots of different high-profile sports. And generally, up until this move, it felt a bit like a lot of the banks had sort of carved out their own area in Australian sport. A National Australian Bank, they're a major partner of AFL. CommBank had Cricket Australia, and they're a big partner of Football Australia. ANZ Bank sponsored the tennis. And Westpac came into the market with NRL a few years ago and sponsor the National Rugby League and the State of Origin teams. So it all felt like it was all quite nicely set, and now it feels like Westpac have marched on to CommBank's turf and taken a big scalp.
Well, both Westpac and Qantas, the away shirt sponsor, they have deals that run through to 2028, which is when the 4-year Olympic cycle for the 2032 Brisbane Olympics and the Paralympics begins. And what's interesting here is that, of course, cricket makes its second appearance in the Olympics in 2028 after the first one in, I think, the year 1900, right? And the 2028 tournament in LA is going to be quite limited. Apparently, there's going to be 6 to 8 teams by invitation, and one would assume that Australia would be part of that. But Brisbane is going to be a much bigger tournament for the cricket, for men's and women's cricket. There'll be regional qualifiers, and there's going to be quite a few more teams. So it's a tournament with some weight, the 2032 cricket tournament in Brisbane. Now, looking at Cricket Australia, they've got Westpac and Qantas, but a lot of brands are going to be looking at the Olympics, a big multi-sport event in Australia. And, you were saying it's a very active market for sports sponsorship, but it's not that big a market. There's, 40 million people there? And will the Olympics have a knock-on effect for Cricket Australia and other rights holders, do you think? Will we have the Westpac and Qantas casting their eye at the Olympics and perhaps not at national federations?
Yeah, this is absolutely, I think, an area to keep an eye on for sort of Australian sponsorship, because, 2032 Olympics is the biggest show in the world, and I think a lot of brands, obviously they're the IOC central sponsors, but then there are lots of categories that sort of the host nations get to sell. And I just think it's quite interesting that both Qantas and Westpac have signed these deals, 4-year deals, nothing to be sniffed at. It's a good long-term, offers CA a lot of stability, particularly given sort of slightly rough time they've had recently. But I just think it's quite interesting that those terms are set to come up around the time that the Brisbane 2032 Olympic cycle starts opening. And, as you say, Australia's not the biggest market. There's a lot of sport there, and there'll be a lot of categories they'll be selling domestically. And I think it's not just CA, it will be all the rights holders that will be sort of put on notice slightly with the categories that will be looking to be a domestic sponsor of Brisbane that may have to find that money from somewhere else. I'm not sure all of them are going to have the money to carry on if they have an existing sponsorship with an Australian rights holder and go for Brisbane. So I just think it's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on to see, who's making moves. I know a lot of people are, have got one eye on those Olympics. Whether they turn that into action, we'll wait and see. But it's certainly going to be something that I'm sure is front of mind for all rights holders in Australia.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to bring John in now. Away from the national team, Cricket Australia's other big commercial draw is the Big Bash League, the limited over tournament, which involves both men's and women's leagues. There have been some new developments there this week. John, can you bring us up to speed on those?
Yeah, so, I mean, this has been something that's been talked about for a couple of years now. The Big Bash is 15 years old, which surprised me, certainly. I didn't think it had been going for that long, and it's got a little bit stale, I think, Cricket Australia feels. Certainly a lot of the players and kind of cricket fans around the world, and what they tasked Boston Consulting Group with looking at ways of freshening it up, if you like, and they've come back at the end of July with some recommendations which will now be discussed by the teams and various stakeholders. And kind of the main ones in this, which piqued our interest, was a scheduling shift to make it more appealable to players, so pushing it kind of beyond the test summer in Australia, which would allow more players to compete, obviously, increasing the salary cap for the same purpose, enticing bigger and better players, and then kind of really interestingly, given what's happened with the 100 in the UK, which we've discussed at depth recently, is the potential to allow private ownership into the 8 teams for the first time, potentially even going beyond 8 teams. If the interest is there, can they expand it to maybe 10 or so? We're still a few years down the road on that. It's now a chance for Cricket Australia to take those findings from Boston Consulting, work with the teams, with the states, the cricket and territories, and work out what the best plan is. But yeah, certainly kind of an interesting time for the Big Bash.
Well, as you mentioned, private investment into cricket is certainly a thing now. Cricket Australia will have been looking at what's happened in the UK with over £500 million of investment. And Australia with the Big Bash League and New Zealand with its Super Smash are really the only 2 cricket powerhouses without private investment in their domestic limited over tournaments. What would interest private equity about the Big Bash League? And are we going to see the Sydney Super Kings or the Melbourne Knight Riders anytime soon?
I think we might, yeah. And I think, 2 big cities there. Faaez talked about it being a sporting powerhouse of a country. There'll be a lot of interest in this. And I have talked at length, and no doubt boring listeners on this, what we see as the multi-club ownership model coming to cricket. You may have jested there with some of the names, but I think you're certainly right. If you look at the owners of the 100 franchises who have come in, the RPSG, who own Lucknow Super Giants in the IPL, they have a team in South Africa. They have a team now in the 100 in Manchester Originals. You've got Reliance that own the Mumbai Indians in the IPL. They bought the Oval Invincibles. And then you've got Sun Group, which own the Sunrisers Hyderabad in the IPL. They now own the Northern Superchargers in the 100. So you can see already those 3 groups putting together a multi-club ownership. There's also teams in the 100 that own teams in Major League Cricket in the US. So I think certainly those groups will certainly be interested in the opportunity of buying a franchise in the Big Bash, which in all intents and purposes is still, Faaez is probably a bigger cricket fan than I am. It's probably still the second biggest franchise, T20 leagues out there. It may not be, if you look at some of the commercial numbers and the fans have been dropping off, but it's certainly, you're not going to reach the level of the IPL, but it's certainly, and they want it to be the next big thing. And you can almost argue it is. It just needs a few tweaks to get there. And I think, what are you buying into? You are buying into a huge fan base. You've got the infrastructure. You have got an opportunity as a private equity firm of investors to come in, like with the 100, kind of make it a hard bargain, make sure you get out of this what you want to be able to commercialize this in your way and really take ownership of it. And I think when you listen to some of the people in Australia who say now is the time for this, what they're looking at really is a chance to break this away from Cricket Australia and the state territories and really freeing it up and making it a more viable commercial operation.
Yeah, I think just to add to what John was saying, which I fully agree with in terms of the multi-club ownership, I think another thing that might have piqued interest, particularly around the BBL, is that the organisation has shown itself that it's willing to be adaptable. It's actually had a bit of a recovery in the previous seasons after changing the format. I think that's something that lots of leagues are often loath to do, that people get very pernickety about the format. But when it was 61 matches, when it was relaunched sort of in 2018-19, that was when it was sort of nosediving really. Viewership was dropping off. I think sponsors weren't that interested because they don't want to see lower numbers, they want to see higher. But they changed it again for the 23-24 season, and they dropped that from 61 to 44 games, and that's actually worked really well for them. Like, they report having a 20% year-on-year increase in viewership across linear and digital platforms for the last BBL. Attendances increased 27% compared to the previous season. CA said that almost every club of the 8 recorded an increase in average attendance. So, that willingness to take quite big decisions to change the format and try and work out the best way to make it commercially viable, I imagine that will probably also be music to the ears of people looking to invest.
We published our global cricket report last month, and in that we heard from people who talked about the investability of cricket. And some of the figures show that private equity started flowing into cricket over a decade ago, and we've seen valuations for IPL teams. They're now worth over $1 billion, whereas in 2009, I think it was, the average value was about 67 million. So no doubt these big companies, the private investors, the Indian conglomerates, they've seen all that, and it's good property to invest in. But will it last? Will there be a return for all these investors? What do you think going forward?
Will there be a return? I mean, how rich are these guys? Do they need immediate return? I don't know. Maybe it's just something nice to have in the portfolio. I think if you look at, and Faaez mentioned there, the flexibility of Cricket Australia, I think it was forced flexibility. The rights holders, Seven and Foxtel, were pretty damning in what they bought here, and decided that when they did the new rights deal, which is 24 onwards, 1.5 billion Aussie dollars, so a big deal over 7 years. They made it quite clear before that deal was done that they wanted some tweaks, and that's, Faaez mentioned the drop in the matches. That contract, I believe, now has a key performance metrics kicking in when the BBL hits certain figures. So I think there is certainly kind of return on investment coming from a broadcast perspective. Those rights deals end 2030-31. Now, the chances are, if these changes do go through in the BBL, how quickly can we be looking at that? If you look at the 100 timeline, you're looking at a couple of years, really, before they kick in. So maybe they'll be in line for a new commercial cycle, it might be, and you would expect these guys that are coming in, the hardened businessmen that they are, will be looking at the broadcast rights and saying, well, we'd like them carved out. We would like them sold separately to the rest of Cricket Australia's summer rights. So could that come from 31-32? And then you're talking about, specifically being able to target how much is the BBL worth as a media property, rather than kind of packaged in with the rest of what Seven and Foxtel buy for the national team. So I don't think they necessarily are buying the Sydney Sixers for a quick return on their investment, Catherine. As you know, these guys have a little bit of cash floating around, but there are clearly, and as you talked about from the cricket report, there are valuations that are going to rise, and they will rise if they get the scheduling right, because you will then get better players playing. At the moment, there's a partial clash, I think, is it Faaez, with the South Africa T20, which does have private investment. Therefore, the prize money's bigger, the salaries are bigger. You've got the ILT20 in the UAE, which a lot of players over the last few years have kind of left the Big Bash to go and play in this because there's got a bit more money in it. If you can bring in these rich backers, they will want the best players playing in it. Potentially one day, maybe Indian players as well, which, when you look at the ownership groups, will dramatically increase the value of this. So yeah, there are commercial returns, but I think they're some way off.
Well, it's certainly a crowded calendar, as you say. We show that in the cricket report with graphs showing how these tournaments all seem to overlap, and there's new tournaments that pop up. There's a new one starting in Canada in September that clashes with a couple of other tournaments. And the crowded calendar has been very problematic. People say that it needs to be cleared up before there's any kind of coherence, really. And there's player fatigue. A lot of tournaments, some tournaments in any case, they had problems with players being paid and players committing to several tournaments at the same time. What do you think the future holds for cricket? Is there going to be a move to having Formula One style global cricket tournament? What do you think about that, Faaez? What do you see 10 years down the road?
I should sell that information. No, I think the general discourse has it that I think we're just moving to more of cricket turning into the football calendar now, where sort of clubs and take primacy over internationals, and players end up sort of signing for a multi-club owner in some regard, and so therefore they play for whatever team that owner owns in India, in England, in Australia, the Caribbean, wherever. That seems to be where it's going. That is an easy way of putting it. There will be a lot of people who, there'll be winners and losers in that system, and people want to make sure their bit of the calendar remains sort of the least sort of cut down. But I don't know about you, John, that seems to be the only way I can think you can squeeze in. I think some of it also will be some tournaments will just have to go, right? The market's going to be too big and the wheat will be sorted from the chaff, most likely by who's got the best backers.
Yeah, I think that's why it's an important time now for the Big Bash League. You're never going to leave Australian cricket behind just because of the powerhouse that it is. But this is the right time for them now. And clearly they've been looking at this and have been advised that there is competition out there. There's competition for players. There's competition for eyeballs. And you need to kind of own that window that they got. The IPL have got that April, well, how big's the IPL getting? But it's that kind of April-May window, isn't it? And if you've got the Big Bash that can have what they're looking at now, which is kind of much more of a January rather than December and January, look to take January over, then you've got, the 100 and it's August and things will kind of dot around there. But I think totally agree with Faaez's point that what I can see happening, and you are starting to see it already, is players will be kind of contracted to a multi-club ownership and they will then be moved around from the Big Bash, then they'll go to here, the South African T20, then the IPL, etc. And you'll see players playing for these kind of group franchises rather than maybe what will happen to the auction? The IPL auction itself has become such a kind of exciting TV rights kind of thing in its own right. Is that going to kind of die a little bit if players are already all contracted to certain teams? But I certainly think that's the way it's going, and because there is just so much of it. And I remember being at an event, I think it was last year, it may even have been in 2023, where Joss Butler was talking about just the demands on players from a load point of view, and just saying for those listeners that aren't aware, Sierra Leone-based listeners, former England T20 captain, one-day captain, probably one of the greatest white ball players there is. He can pick and choose where he goes and he can afford to do so, but a lot of players can't, and it needs clearing up, the calendar for sure. And I know that Faaez and myself have done stories before on the Players Union that are working together on trying to clear up the calendar a little bit and make it easier for players to be able to earn a living year round. But I think these multi-club owners are going to be the way forward.
Right. Well, I think we've just about done all we can do about cricket today. Unless you have anything else to say, gentlemen, we'll end section 1 of the podcast and we'll be back after a very short break with section 2. Thanks very much, you two, and we'll see you soon.
For a weekly roundup of the biggest stories shaping global sport, sign up to the Weekly Digest, our free newsletter packed with essential insights. Subscribe at sportbusiness.com.
Welcome back to the Sport Business Podcast, bringing you the latest sports business industry news. In part 2 of today's podcast, I'm talking to sport business media reporter Maria Kholodova, who has just published a major in-focus piece on the WTA, the Women's Professional Tennis Tour. Maria, in this piece, you look at the WTA's broadcast big picture and you touch on what's happening with the tour when its groundbreaking 10-year deal with DAZN, which led to the creation of the WTA Media Joint Venture, expires at the end of 2026. Can you give some background on that and shed some light on what's going to happen going forward?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. And the WTA currently sells its media rights through, like you said, WTA Media, which was established on the back of the DAZN deal, which was performed at the time back in 2016-2017. That deal included betting video rights, production, the whole thing, and essentially made Perform, then DAZN, the seller of the WTA's media rights. That deal ends in 2026, which means that those media rights from 2026 onwards will be sold by this new entity called WTA Ventures. WTA Ventures was established in 2023, and that's the commercial arm of the WTA. It will take on the media rights as the commercial rights holder and is now kind of staffing out their media rights arm. And Sport Business reported exclusively last week that Jessica Chanderly, who was the French Tennis Federation's head of media rights, is actually set to join WTA Ventures as its senior vice president for media, which is a great hire for the WTA and somebody who's truly a veteran in the business and, of course, knows the sport and the tennis markets globally inside out. And there's also some deals that have been struck by WTA Media that actually go a bit beyond 2026, like the Sky deals with WTA and ATP. I think they go till 2028. So there's a couple of them out there that are still going to go beyond that 26 mark, but most of it will be kind of a fresh slate 2026 onwards.
So you wrote about how WTA Ventures has already begun striking deals for 2026 and beyond, and you've just mentioned that now. What are those key deals and what do they entail?
Yeah, so first deal I believe that was struck directly by WTA Ventures as opposed to WTA Media was in China. And that was obviously really interesting for a few reasons, and one of them being that that was the first time the WTA had been back on screens in China in a few years, following what happened with the Peng Shuai affair. And so that was interesting. They now have, I believe, three different media rights deals with Migu, Tencent, and Youku. And those were actually struck with the Peak agency who are helping them out in those markets. And obviously it's not financially anywhere near what it was before, back when China was a super booming market for the WTA, but it's a really good start and it's a good kind of first win for WTA Ventures. The other one that was done recently that we reported on a couple weeks ago was the WTA Tennis Channel deal in the US. And that was obviously a really big get for the Tennis Channel, as they need that year-round content to kind of fill out its schedule. And of course, there isn't really anywhere else it could have gone if you think about what the tennis market looks like in the US and really how much time you need for all those tournaments that happen year-round. And that was a really good financial success for the WTA as well. And they had IMG advising on that deal. And we understand that the IMG will kind of be helping them out on a case-by-case basis if they, need help in specific markets. And IMG is obviously very well versed in the US market, especially regarding tennis. And so I think that was a good deal for them as well. We'll see what kind of agencies and things like that they end up bringing in for their deals going forward. As kind of a newer arm in terms of selling media rights, I would imagine they will need some help in some places. And that's what they've done so far with China and the US. But now that they're staffing out their media rights department as well, we'll see how they end up getting along with that.
Interesting what you say about Peak helping the WTA out in China, because of course Peak have helped La Liga in Spain with some of their rights sales in their current contract, even though they're not necessarily going to be doing it going forward. They're bringing a lot of it in-house, but they're well placed to help sports like tennis and La Liga, of course, in China. So interesting development there. Now, as we explored in our global tennis report, which was released at the end of last year, there's been a lot of very strong talk about the WTA and the ATP, the men's tour, merging. And Andrea Gaudenzi of the ATP Tour told us that a new entity, Tennis Ventures, would be up and running by 2027 and would incorporate ATP Media, WTA Ventures that you've just been talking about, Tennis Data Innovations, the 2020 JV set up by the ATP to manage its match data and betting streaming rights, as well as other assets. And Gaudenzi at the time told us that a merger was a no-brainer. It's the only way that tennis as a sport as a whole can fully reach its potential in terms of market value. Have there been any changes, Maria, since we wrote that report last autumn about how the two sides, or at least how the WTA are approaching this?
So from what we understand, talks have actually really accelerated in recent weeks with a view, like you said, Catherine, to bring the ATP and the WTA commercial sides closer together. And as you know, in a lot of ways, they've already started doing that. They had that Sky deal, which was really great and innovative and kind of a first of its kind across the WTA and the ATP, as I mentioned earlier. So that's in all the territories that Sky is active. So in the DAC market, in the DAC territories in the UK and in Italy. And of course, when you actually look at how it breaks down, the ATP is worth more of that chunk that Sky is paying than the WTA. But it's still an interesting way to kind of see those two working closely together on things so big such as media rights. And I think we'll see that even before any actual merger happens, we'll see that happen more and more. And what's interesting as well is that the Stats Perform betting, video, and data rights deal for the WTA, in 2023, they extended that from 27 until 2029. And that's actually, from what we understand, in order to align the WTA and the ATP's data rights together so that maybe in the future there's a view to kind of combine them together, because the betting market for tennis is just insane. It's pretty much behind football, as in soccer, in terms of global betting value. So there's a lot of money to be had there, and maybe even more if you combine the two. And I actually spoke to WTA Ventures CEO Marina Storti about this at Queen's in June in London, and about the WTA and ATP working closer together. And actually she told me something that I found really interesting, which is that on the sponsorship side, there are some brands that actually want to work specifically with the WTA, whether that's because of their brand as opposed to the ATP, whether that's because they want to specifically work in women's sports, whether they are a women's health brand, whether they have it as part of their mission to grow women's and girls' sports participation in specific countries. And that's actually something that I hadn't thought about as I work more on the media rights side. But it's interesting to think about how there's some things that will have to kind of be separate in terms of that sponsorship side for brands kind of looking to work specifically with either the men or probably mostly the women.
That presents complications at tournaments, at joint tournaments in the States, for example. Andrea Gaudenzi told me about how they have sponsors for the WTA and they have the banners on the nets or behind at the end of the courts, and they have to switch them over for the men's game when there's a men's game on that same court in the next slot. So it doesn't really... you're merging the two tours, but there are still going to be problems that emerge with, like you say, with the different kinds of sponsorship, with different focuses. Is that going to be an impediment to a merger going forward, do you think?
I don't think that any of those things that will kind of be a barrier, it's not like they haven't given it thought, and it's not like they've considered all the things that will have to be dealt with and taken care of while they're working on this merger process. The thing about it is that it will take a really long time. I say long time. It'll be, I reckon, a couple of years while they're actually trying to figure out how exactly the commercial arms work together, how the money is split, which is a really big one because, obviously, sure, women's tennis is really popular, and compared to some of the other splits in other sports between men and women, women's tennis is up there closer to the men, but there is still a difference. The ATP is bringing in more media rights fees than the WTA is. And, that's something that they'll have to think about in terms of how they split those revenues, whether they help the WTA out in some way. And I guess that's what they've been working on for ever since they kind of started talking about doing a merger. And I reckon little issues like that will kind of come up. There's probably small things we're not even thinking about, like you said, with the courts. It'll be a lot of different kinds of things like that. But I think eventually it'll smoothen out and they'll figure out a way to actually go forward with it.
And have you heard anything in your chats with people at Queen's and out there about how to incorporate, if this is still part of the plan, how to incorporate the Grand Slams into this tennis ventures?
I'm not sure. It's not something that's come up in any of my conversations, but I actually think, especially in terms of media rights, it won't really be a factor because the Grand Slams sell their own media rights. You have the ALTC in the UK, the FFT in France, USTA in the US, and Tennis Australia in Australia. And so, at least obviously there will be things that come up through the merger that will affect the Grand Slams, but it's more of a clean cut, if you will, compared to, like you mentioned, some of the joint ATP WTA tournaments and other things like that. I think it will be easier to incorporate. If anything, it'll be better for them because they'll have to work with one entity instead of two at the slams. But I think at least in that way, it'll be a bit easier for them.
So it's certainly an ongoing process and something we'll be tuning into over the next 3, 4, 5 years to see how it progresses. It's watch this space, right?
Who's to say?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Maria. That's great insight as usual. And I'm sure we'll have you back on the pod soon. Great stuff. And we're going to be moving on to part 3 of the podcast after a short break.
Enjoying the conversation? Follow the Sport Business Podcast and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're finding it valuable, leave us a rating and a review to help others discover the show.
Welcome back to part 3 of the Sport Business Podcast. John is still with me, and we've also got Martin Ross, our global news editor, on the line today. As always, it's good to have you on the pod, Martin. Thanks for joining in.
Hello, Catherine. I missed the cricket bit, which may have been a blessing in disguise given Scotland's recent loss to Italy, which we won't really discuss further.
Well, this week you're going to be talking about something different. You're going to parse the latest developments in the world of sports betting rights, data and technology. Let's get straight to it. In announcing the company's second quarter results this week, Mark Locke, the CEO of Genius Sports, spoke of an emerging duopoly with Sportradar. Martin, can you set the scene for us? When did 5 become 2, and why is the market consolidating?
Yeah, sure, Catherine. It's kind of results week this week. We've had Sportradars and Geniuses and others in broadcast world. It might benefit to explain this sector a little bit first. Maybe not all of our listeners will be engrossed in the world of betting rights and technology. In many ways, it's very complicated, and in very ways, it isn't. I suppose at the heart of it is data, and the history of it is the collection of match data at sports events. So companies collecting it, collating it, and selling it to bookmakers. Football Data Co was a very early example here in the UK with English leagues and the Scottish leagues for rights that were kind of commercialised. So when we talk about rights, and we talk about more than that, but we mean data betting rights. So just that, this collection of data from matches and bookmakers buying it and putting it on their websites for people to bet on. Betting video, which is betting streams on bookmakers' websites. So the rights for bookmakers to do that. I don't know if anybody's ever dabbled in that. Usually there are restrictions around how big the window can be so that it's not competitive to the TV broadcast. And then there's also media data that's sold, sort of match data, sold to broadcasters and media companies. And beyond that, there's also some performance data which clubs will buy. So this week, Mark Locke, the CEO of Genius, interestingly talked about a duopoly in this world. If we kind of roll back 4 or 5 years, there were 5. Well, there were 4 and then 5, maybe 3 years ago. The 4 were Genius Sports, Sportradar, Stats Perform, and IMG Arena, which previously was IMG Gaming. And then Infront launched a betting arm about 3 years ago called Infront Better. So yeah, this world has changed so much. I mean, 5 years ago, Sportradar and Genius were going public. Sportradar was valued at $8 billion at that time, believe it or not. Private equity was really involved, sniffing around, bought into Stats, which was the kind of data company that Fox Sports sold, and then merged Perform, become Stats Perform in 2019. So we've gone past the period of big competition between 5, and lots of rights holders kind of made hay while the sun shined, LFP being one of them. They signed a deal worth 31 million euros a year for their betting rights with Infront Better. We are now in a period of market correction. Endeavour has paid to get rid of IMG Arena to Sportradar. We discussed this in the first podcast, actually, our debut. So maybe go back to that one for a bit more on that. But it was, 125 million they paid to get it off its hands, plus 100 million of US dollars to correct rights deals that had been done. And Stats Perform we'll maybe talk about a bit later on, but they have been for sale for a few years. Sony Hawkeye nearly bought them. They didn't. And Infront, the wider Infront group, the sale of that is getting closer. What that means for Infront Better, we will see. And just finally on the space and how much the market has corrected and affected rights values, which we will talk about, is there's also a lot of sub-licensing now going on in the same way that happens in the media world when 2 players will reach an accord. Genius and Infront have done quite a lot of this, certainly around League One. So all of this, and now with just down to 2 main players, although Infront Better is still certainly a bona fide player, we are in a very different dynamic. And Mark Locke was keen to talk about that this week.
Well, you alluded to the impact it's having, the consolidation is having on the value of betting rights. And as you said, Mark Locke said something about it in his presentation the other day as well. Specifically, how is this consolidation how did it affect the value of Genius's recently announced deals with Serie A and European leagues? Yeah,
he made some interesting comments. I mean, we did a story yesterday, which was Wednesday. We're recording this on a Thursday, so have a look on sportbusiness.com for that. He made comments around a fundamentally transforming model of the deals. He talked about rationalized space, and then beyond that, obviously talked about duopoly that become very clear. The market will become even more rational. He's talking to, analysts and investors. He's also talking to the market. So you're not going to come out and say, we've got a big pot of cash and we're going to spend it. He did a similar kind of warning us, if you like, a year ago on the back of the NFL and Premier League data deals, which heavy deals, but onerous, you could say, but crucial. And after that, he said he would only do deals that were effectively profitable. Accretive is a word they like in these calls. So, he has made some comments around tech. I mean, tech is a big subject for them at the moment related to, there was 2 deals announced, Serie A for the betting video and data and European leagues. By that, we mean 18 different member leagues all pooled together their data rights, and these were acquired by Genius. So they will start to roll out. They've all got kind of flashy product names, which generally have AI and IQ in them. BetVision is the latest one, which is kind of cool. I don't know if you have a look. I mean, it's essentially watching a betting stream with live odds and all these graphics overlaid onto it. It was rolled out with NFL first of all. You can actually even touch the player, I think, on the screen, and up will come their odds and their performance and stuff. So Genius IQ is their kind of match collection infrastructure that they will now build into this European Leagues deal. So he's made general comments which were interesting about, he said that the business has invested a lot over the last few years in technology, and we've been clear that over the course of that investment, we would be seeing a reduction in rights fees and our ability to trade technology for improved commercial deals. We're starting to see this across the rights deals we're doing. Did this affect Serie A and European leagues? I mean, I suppose so, yes. And I think increasingly when we're writing about this, we need to cater in the sort of tech spend as this deal. It's not just a rights deal anymore. But there were kind of a set of circumstances with both of those without getting too bogged down. Serie A was a deal that Stats Perform had, and then during Sportel last year, that was the big topic. Stats Perform withdrew. There's a legal case ongoing. Stats Perform are going through a kind of review of their business model, the shareholders very much involved in that, and whether that deal was creating value. That deal had been, I think, double what was paid previously, the Stats Perform deal. This deal, and we will be reporting on this in SB Media, so I'm not going to give away the number, but they've certainly, the value has gone down. Although I think Serie A has done a good deal and they've managed to recover a lot of that. So yeah, there was that element to Serie A. And on the European League side, and this is where it gets really interesting around data collection, which is a big topic for this whole industry, that kind of piracy, if you like. So, people turning up as scouts at matches when another company has authorized kind of collection rights. So IMG Arena held the European League's contract. They went to court against Stats Perform, believing that Stats had deployed scouts against their agreement to collect the data. Then, after being taken over by Sportradar, I think IMG Arena were told to settle by Sportradar, which they have done now. So that, I think, will have affected the value of this deal as well. And even in this call this week, Mark Locke said that the rights fee paid for European leagues was a fraction of what it could be, a top-heavy fraction, who knows? But we know what he meant. He meant a small amount of what IMG Arena was paying. So, bigger picture, tech is very much what these companies want to talk about now, and very much putting out a signal that they will increasingly be part of rights deals, coupled with the market correction, which is bad news for rights holders, because we've gone through the days of growth. We are now very much, numbers are coming down again.
Well, it sounds from what you're saying that the business model is shifting, isn't it? Tech and data are going to be interlinked, but are Genius and Sportradar reducing their reliance on the betting industry to focus more on tech and data provision for other clients?
Yeah, it's often tricky when you're trying to, do my best here, I suppose, to explain what these companies do. If we have a layman listening to the pod, I don't know. From a PR point of view, just a sort of slight diversion, but if you were looking at these companies, Sportradar, Genius, Stats Perform 2 or 3 years ago, maybe, so much of the communication was around integrity. They were the kind of good Samaritans that were out there to help the rights holders and get paid to solve any, sort of kill any match fixing threats and all the rest of it. And that was all because you wouldn't want to overtly talk about we are making all the money from gambling. Well, not all of the money, but most of the money. So that has kind of shifted a bit now to them wanting to talk more about tech. This week, actually, I looked at the integrity revenue. Sportradar's revenue share from integrity was 1.8%. So that just shows you it's a tiny slice. Really, really interesting comments this week from Mark Locke, who, maybe just read them out in terms of where they think the company's going. He said, we expect the media business, and we'll talk about what the media business is, but size-wise to be at least the same size and medium to long term bigger than the betting business. And now that is some shift. To give you some context, the betting tech content services in Q2 was $194 million revenue. Media, same equivalent media, was 44.5. So we're a long way from it shifting, but that's where he says it's going. And by that, he means, so non-betting revenue would be clients such as broadcasters, media outlets, sponsors activating, rights holders, ad agencies. Examples would be Madden NFL Cast, which was NBC Sports and Peacock, which was a whole bunch of kind of overlays, graphics, player ratings, which are updating, very dynamic viewing experience. It would be AI highlights that are being clipped. It would be the kind of match data that I talked about earlier, kind of shots on goal, that kind of stuff that people want to build into a broadcast. I think all the team scouting, performance stuff would fall into maybe the sport vertical. So tech is a huge, big bucket. So, it's hard to say it's shifting away from betting to tech because the two are intrinsically linked. But according to Genius, there will be a greater shift to media generally. There is a much less of an appetite for the reasons explained to invest in the right space in the same way that they have. And they're predicting a media increase, I think, of 20% full year revenue increase. So it is changing times, and I think despite certain markets deregulating, a sign that betting and data, which was seen as kind of like the cash cow a few years ago, and all the investors were getting excited about it, and there's a lot of hype in the industry, it's not got such a rosy future, but will continue to exist. People will always want to gamble, and they'll always want the information. So that industry will always be there. I may or not gamble now and again, but just as a disclaimer.
Just on Martin's point there, the kind of value of this a few years ago, just looking at the share prices, Genius's share price 4 years ago was $22.4 per share, and it's now half of that. It's 12.2. Although that they have actually improved that over the last few years, where it was low. Sportradar's, interestingly, is almost as high as it's been. It's up at $28 a share. So just interesting on that. Martin, I just wanted to ask you your input on two companies. Obviously, we talked at the start about this has gone from 5 to 2. IMG Arena, obviously, the payment to sell them to Sportradar. But there are two other players here, Infront Better and Stats Perform. What's their immediate prognosis of those two? Are they both on the market, or are they still active?
The share price is really interesting, actually, just to start on that. I looked at that as well. The Sportradar figure is basically the level that they started trading at 2021, which is interesting. And Genius is also, if you take it back maybe a year or two further, I think it started trading in 2020, is also now back at $11.89 a share. It's been a slower recovery. It sort of tanked in 2022, but is now also back at sort of level it was when the IPO. So the kind of steep drop has happened a few years ago. Remember, we would write these results stories, and I get texts from people saying, have you seen the figures, but look at their share price. So it's recovered a bit since. Infront Better is an interesting one. I think it's widely acknowledged that they spent a lot of money on rights fees to establish market position. Infront, as a wider company, has quite a lot of debt. Does somebody want to take on Infront Better? Genius is your obvious candidate, and this is a hypothesis, not something we know is happening. But if we are, and interesting that Mark Locke didn't mention anybody else apart from them in Sportradar this week. Logically, you could see that happening, but again, that's just a hypothesis. There has been sort of sub-licensing deals between the two. Stats Perform, I think is still for sale and has been for a long time. They've gone through a hell of a lot of turmoil over the last 12 months, really. Alex Rice leaving from a personnel point of view being the headline there, but they have recruited. I think Miles Watson came in recently, so to head up or to be part of that kind of rights division. So they are still active. They're still acquiring rights, but I think the Serie A case taught us any appetite to overpay for rights is not there, and that the owners, Vista, is going to be very involved in the future of the business. So I'm not expecting a aggressive sort of spend by Stats Perform. I think the one everybody's looking at the moment is Genius, because the Serie A and European League ones have come very close back to back, just 12 months on from when we were told that, we've got kind of everything we need. We'll only do these on a case-by-case basis. But to be fair, I think these two were individual cases which had a bit of baggage behind them, which has affected the rights value. So, and IMG Arena, of course, is in the process of being sort of bundled into Sportradar pending a investigator, UK market authority regulator review. So it's still an interesting space. If you're geeks like us, it is quite interesting.
Speak for yourself, geeks like you. Martin, there was a lot of hype about these companies when they went public 4 or 5 years ago. Sports data was the future. The liberating US betting market was going to be a goldmine. Private equity was sniffing around. What have these latest developments taught us about where this slice of the industry sits today?
I think the share price conversation is interesting, that there has been a recovery after a hard 4 or 5 years, but if you're predicting that, maybe that's going to level off. Who knows? Genius's results this week, they reported a $54 million net loss, which had widened from last year. Sportradar actually reported a €49 million profit versus a $2 million deficit same time last year, but there was a $54 million foreign currency gain. Yeah, that is pretty crucial to the profit. 106 million sports rights expenses, I think, was the figure for Sportradar that just released as the most recent sort of quarterly figure. Yeah, they're going through some pain in terms of these rights fees that they have paid and are now in the middle of. Interesting that Genius, and we haven't talked about maybe Genius hiving off some equity to NFL, which previously is their deal, which they said this week they wouldn't do with any other sports rights holder, interestingly. I think there's a gritty realism about where the space is. We're a long way from the initial valuations of the IPO, and I say the hype that was there, but I think the thirst for data remains, whatever data that is. We've talked about the different facets there, and the growth, for anybody who watched Madden NFL Cast, for anybody who, may have been, as I talked about, sort of the way you can bet now, and Genius, it's all pretty exciting stuff. There is an appetite there to spend on it, and it's pretty viewer facing. So, and the other thing is, I suppose, different markets opening up in the same way that when the media rights industry, everything it's gone through the last few years, you would look to emerging markets, whether it's, Korea for a while was very fruitful market, or, MENA a long time ago. So Brazil, India and China, all kind of different stages of opening up. How much are these dynamics going to help them tap into new revenues? So I'm not painting a bleak picture, but yeah, it's certainly one that is really moving very fast, and the monetization of it is also shifting very quickly as well.
Well, I can't say I've ever been tempted to part with my money on sports betting, but I know millions do, and it's certainly growing, particularly with the liberalization in North America. But I think we've covered that very well today. Thank you both. Let's move into the final part of the Sport Business Podcast and looking ahead to the coming week. What's on your radar? Martin, John?
Yeah, well, actually, I think it's the same, actually, Martin. I think we wanted to talk a little bit about football coming. Did football actually go away? I don't think it's had a break, has it?
I thought football came home very, very recently.
It's always been home, Martin.
Oh, I see.
So, yeah, I'm trying to work out what season we're in, but we are about to start officially the 25-26 season. And Martin, I thought it might be a good little chance to look at some of the big leagues in Europe, if we class the Big Five as if Liga still makes it into the Big Five, and kind of maybe their broadcast struggles. Would that be the right word, Martin? If you look at where they're kind of being shown in their major market. We did a story this week, or Martin did a story that I'll let him talk about with La Liga in the UK. But yeah, interesting just to see where those leagues are being shown and how changing it is. I was just looking at Serie A, who this year are on DAZN in every major market, which would make you think there was obviously discussions about their domestic deal and how they've been supported by DAZN in other markets. So they're about to be on DAZN in France this year. That'll be the third different place to watch Serie A in the last 3 years in France. It shows just the difficulty in getting kind of long-term deals in those markets. So they're going to be on DAZN. They're already in DAZN in Spain. They're already in DAZN in the DAC region. Yeah, Serie A is going to be on DAZN in the UK as well this year for the first time. So they're kind of well set, but other leagues, that's not the picture, Martin.
Yeah, I think, again, it was at Sportel last year, actually, when the news of finally there was a Serie A deal in France with L'Equipe, which our good friend and colleague Imran wrote a good feature about in terms of the value on Sport Business Media. But yeah, it was a kind of bit of a line in the sand as to where these leagues are and how late, and then in that case, beyond the season start, deals were being done when previously, certainly from a UK point of view, you would have Sky and BT Sport as it was, kind of trading these rights, not trading the rights, but trading who owned them, and have 2 or 3 year deals locked up. Yeah, we're still Bundesliga. Future in the UK is TBC. We have an idea, but we'll maybe wait. Going to possibly be publishing something on that, but it can be very last minute now, and every season we're seeing this in the Big Five markets, which is just a reflection of negotiations and how difficult they can be now. As you say, the interesting one was La Liga, which we spoke about Disney in a previous pod. We did a story on Tuesday. Credit to the FT who first reported that Disney was in talks. We took that on and then exclusively reported that Disney was going to get the Saturday night evening game. Premier would get the rest, and that it was 3 year deals. Interesting that it's a Saturday night game from a Disney point of view. Disney Plus, they'll obviously be streaming it, because I think the kids, I don't have kids, I know you do, John, and you do, Catherine, but yeah, I think the remote gets taken over by kids during the day, streaming whatever they want on Disney and Disney Plus. Well, that's suitable. And then in the evening, I think maybe Disney's looked at this and thought, well, how can we get some appointment to view programming that, the adults would want to watch in the evening? And there's a bit of a gap there, a bit of a lull. So maybe that's the motivation behind that. But again, it's gone down to the wire. And yeah, we're increasingly seeing this. But in my mind, the big league started weeks ago. SPFL started last weekend. The Danish Superliga started. Is it now? I don't think it's a summer league anymore. It is well up to speed, John, as we saw with a Man of the Match award for Maxime Soulas, who was awarded a sack of potatoes. Well, it was a wheelbarrow of potatoes, and he plays for. Are you going to pronounce the club for us? I think you know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, it's Sonderjyske.
Oh, there we go.
Well, a sack of potatoes, is that a step up from what the Norwegians were giving their players, or a step aside?
There's a few sacks of potatoes playing in the SPFL, that's for sure.
Just on, interestingly, I remember a feature that Frank Dunn wrote, and I think it was last year, Martin might correct me if I'm wrong, about clubs or leagues having to go direct to consumer and, the different strategies they might deploy in different markets. And indeed, spoke to someone this week that confirmed that Ligue 1 in the UK will remain. So they have their Ligue 1 pass, which carries the matches which you pay for. And then they're continuing with their pay-per-view on Amazon. So certain games will be on Amazon in the UK. If you want to watch Montpellier against Nancy, you're going to pay. It's quite well priced, $2.99. And someone I was speaking to about a month ago said, actually, and this is an independent person, not someone who is employed by Amazon, was saying actually it's working quite well for both Amazon and Ligue 1, that strategy of having a pay-per-view in the UK. Interesting to see if other leagues will follow suit. I know Amazon have been doing the same with Nations League, I think, as well in the UK. But it's just, as Martin says, just testament to the struggle that these leagues have. And also, looking at League starts on Friday, I think the 15th. Interesting to see how their new channel is going to do, because it needs to work for them, because I'm not sure what's next.
I think, well, if it doesn't, then maybe the McDonald's Big Mac offer plus subscription should be revived from last season, or Filet-O-Fish, as Callum once mentioned.
Well, what about any other business that you've been looking at? I think, John, you had something to do.
Well, I did. Martin actually stole my any other business there by mentioning our man from Sonderjyske, but he gives me a chance to do my pronunciations because I've missed out on the Latin American broadcasters. But actually, fans of the pod will fondly remember Martin's any other business about Bern in the Norwegian First Division. Well,
Brune FK.
Brune FK. My apologies. Bern sounds like an Irish team.
Bern in Switzerland.
Brune FK. Well, they're not to be kind of outdone by Sonderjyske. They lost, in a friendly to Viking FC, but their left back scored, Lasse Kvikstad. And he got some food. He got 40 bags of oatmeal, 100 eggs, and 20 litres of milk. So breakfast round his house for the next year. So we will continue on our Nordic quest to see how these players are compensated.
And a pack of Rennies as well.
You need it after that, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I just wanted to dabble in a different sport. It's a major league. It's one of the big major leagues. It's Major League Fishing. There's a major league of everything. If it was Sportel last year, the Major League Paintball were there. So there was a press release that landed this week, and it's a landmark move. It says, I think the bar for landmark in industry PR is very low, but this is a landmark move. Rural Media Group and Major League Fishing have announced that their RFD TV are going to exclusively show MLF Team Series presented by Bass Pro Shops to a national television audience for the first time. I mean, we could go down all sorts of different rabbit holes of puns here, but they did say that the last time, I think it was on linear TV, Fox showed the 1999 Ranger M1 Millennium, first time a bass fishing tournament appeared on linear TV, and it reeled in, their words, not mine, more than 2 million viewers. I haven't corroborated that, but there we go. Yeah, I mean, as I said, let's maybe leave the puns alone, even though we could do several just for the halibut. But it just reminded me a little bit of Barry Hearn and Fishermania. And I just love, if everybody hasn't seen the BBC documentary many years ago about Barry Hearn, it's brilliant. And on that, they talk about how he negotiated with Sky. And I think I think Barney Francis at the time, and Sky would be like, well, we want PDC darts, we really want this, and we'll pay extra. And it's like, well, yeah, you can take it, but we've got a matchroom portfolio, and you're gonna show Fishermania again, aren't you? So yeah, Fishermania which has been shown. I don't know if it's still on, but it used to be on Sky Sports. Even when they didn't have loads and loads of channels, it would find a way onto Sky. So yeah, that just fondly made me think of Barry Hearn's negotiation tactics, but I will not be tuning in. I think for me it is a load of carp.
Well, when you mentioned Bass Pro Shops, that made me realize that this really is big league. Have you ever been into one of those places?
I have not been into a Bass Pro Shop. Martin mentioned Barry Hearn then, it just reminded me, I read a story in the week that he had his annual fishing competition that Luke Littler took part in, and Barry Hearn, ever the good sport he is, he's 77, he looks incredible for that. He was pictured riding a mechanical bull as part of, I don't know if it was a punishment, maybe he didn't win the fishing competition, but I think he lasted, it says here, pretty well. I think he lasted over 7 seconds on this mechanical bull, so well done, Barry. Good work.
They have those in the Bass Pro Shops. It's a theme park all in one. It's
okay.
Extraordinary experience. But anyway, that's great, you guys. What a great way to wrap up this week's pod. And if you want to know more about today's stories or any of our other reports and analyses, and especially if you're looking for the world's largest collection of accurate rights fees across media and sponsorship, you can take a look at subscription options on our website or get in touch with us via email at info@sportbusiness.com. Again, that's info@sportbusiness.com. And if you enter the code SBPodcast30 at the checkout, you'll get a 30% discount on annual and monthly Sport Business subscriptions. You can also share your thoughts on this episode and give us your feedback in a review on the Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms. And watch for our weekly LinkedIn posts promoting the podcasts, where you can, of course, also leave a comment. Thank you all for tuning in, for reading, and for subscribing. I'm Catherine Davies, and we'll be back again next week with the Sport Business Podcast.